So this is lecture 2 in the Western intellectual tradition. I'll be focusing on the Jewish political heritage, and I'll be calling it a polyphonic tradition itself. Polyphony just means in Greek many, and phonos, just many voices. When we study Western culture and civilization, it's a complex phenomena. The older tradition, which continues to have ongoing relevance, is the Jewish tradition as it's being played out in Israel today and Palestinians in the Middle East. The oldest political manifesto in a very comprehensive, thought-through way is Deuteronomy, which in Greek just means deuteros, the second, the political laws, just not that you would get in what's called the Ten Commandments, in terms of how people are to relationship, the vertical relationship to God, and then the horizontal relationship to people, and how people are to understand property, relationships, marriage, many other areas in life itself. And so the Jewish tradition has what's called the Shema. You're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself. That gets fleshed out more in the Decalogue. Most people would be aware of the Ten Commandments. Deca just means 10 in Greek, logos, the reflections or the insights on the pathway that is worth walking to a meaningful life, versus if you ignore these waymarks, these trails, then chaos ensues. The community falls apart, relationships implode in a meaningful manner, and people can't trust one another. And so the Decalogue was an attempt at a very general way to say here are certain conditions in terms of the vertical and horizontal, and how a person is to make sense communally. We live in a culture dominated largely by autonomous individualism. Coming from the Jewish tradition, they thought community, collective, you were knit together with others people. So how in that being knit together does one live community? What are the standards by which people can live together, recognizing that you don't steal from one another, you don't commit adultery, you don't take land from other people, treatment of parents, for example. These are basic relational property issues that if misunderstood, then of course lead to the breakdown of relationships, the breakdown of friendships, the breakdown of family, the breakdown of community. So what you've got in the Jewish tradition in its earliest phase is an attempt to say, listen, here is a path worth walking. If you stay on this path, you're going to reach a meaningful destination. If you veer off that pathway, there are consequences in terms of your own soul, your identity, your relationships, your friendships, community. So there are two paths to take, and the Decalogue is an attempt to say, here's the topographical map, follow it, and you'll get to the destination that will give you great sights to see. Ignore that, and you'll be wandering in the landscape of meaning with no sense of direction, and in one sense disconnected in any significant sense from meaningful community in that sense. So the Decalogue is really, and it became, of course, part of Western civilization's ethical code, the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue. But the Deuteronomy is the political manifesto in a class like this, where is concerned with the layers of Jewish thought, and some, of course, remain within the Jewish tradition, but things like the Ten Commandments have transcended Judaism, and they're just a standard part, really, of Western thought for people who still have a memory of what civilizations are built on, ethics and standards, and what happens when those standards are ignored. Where does it lead to in terms of cultures, identity, and these sorts of things? And so the Jewish tradition has very much shaped and informed significant elements of Western civilization, because Christianity emerged from the womb of Judaism, just in some way the Sikh tradition emerged from the womb of Hinduism and Islam. And Guru Nanak is synthesizing two elements of those those northern Indian traditions. So Christianity, and so Islam itself emerges from elements of Judaism and Christianity itself. But Judaism is foundational to understand because it played a significant role in early Christianity. And as early Christianity tried to interpret that, they collided inevitably with the Jewish tradition, how you interpret the Hebrew canon and the Apocrypha itself. And then, of course, it's not just interesting in terms of archaeological, as it were, cultural archaeology or museum culture. It's significant because of the ongoing conflict in Israel today with the Palestinians. And whether a person is religious or not is really quite beside the point in trying to at least bring to the fore aspects of the Jewish heritage, because without an understanding of that history, then there's no comprehension of why the collision in the Middle East and why the Jews are there and not in Latin America or Africa, for example. Why did they have to go to this small little plot on the earth of all the possibilities where they could have chosen? Why didn't they choose Russia or Japan? Or why this particular? Well, that's a story that's rooted in a biblical narrative that then has implications for the politics in the area today. So not to understand these antecedents, textual, historical, that lead to political realities we live with today, is then to be bereft of not being able to understand what's going on. One of the dilemmas we face today is the dominance of two things which have often blinkered people's ability to understand. It's concealed from them the deeper ways of making sense of these particular issues. One is a secular ideology in which the sacred is subordinated, dismissed, is outdated. We're leaving that behind. And so then when it comes to understanding many of these civilizations in the world, whether First Nations, whether elements of Israel today, go around the world, Africa, Middle East, the rise of Catholicism in Latin America, these civilizations still are deeply sacred and immersed in. But if a person comes with a secular education in which it dismisses or subordinates the sacred in these cultures, then they lack the ability to how to interpret what's happening in the present tense in terms of the conflicts, the crisis, the wars, the violence that goes on. Or they just take the negative elements of the sacred and don't see the positive elements of the sacred. The other, of course, is the liberal notion of Hegelian progressivism. Not that Hegel was secular, he wasn't. He was always trying to understand how the divine spirit, or the Weltgeist in that sense, was being active at each moment of history. But that secularized Hegelian progressivism leads to why would we be interested in the past? It's a lower level of understanding. They weren't quite as enlightened as we are. And so what you then tend to get is a lack of understanding and what we would call memoricide. Interestingly enough, for example, the First Nations are constantly concerned with the demeaning of their memory. And many other cultures are very much a part of, absorbed in that matrix of liberal progressivism, which distorts, demeans, colonizes memory by essentially arguing those things of the past are not as relevant and cannot speak to us in the present. So the studying of Judaism and the Jewish tradition as a heritage, and the texts which are so much a part of it, are an attempt to, even if a person wants to be minimally educated in understanding what's happening in the world today, they have to understand the Bible, because the Bible continues to play, sadly so often not at universities, which elements of it are highly secular, but in the real world where things are taking place in politics and social issues and war and peace and wealth and poverty, religion is central to understanding all of that. So a purely secular approach that either demeans, distorts, or caricatures leaves people inept and inadequate to understanding what is happening in the world today, of which obviously the Jewish story is a part. Now, the bulk of the Bible, which is it's Jewish, probably 80% of the Bible, or what the Jews called the Old Testament or the Hebrew canon, is the Jewish story. It's the choosing of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, which are called the patriarchs. They're chosen and their promised land in that process. And this combination of chosenness and land, and then the question is where land, because inevitably people live on land. And if a person is going to go to a certain area and take the land, they're inevitably going to take the land from other people. And the Jewish story is very, very much, and I deal with this a little bit in the Western Peace Traditions course also, about being an oppressed people in Egypt, because Exodus is really about the oppression of the Jews, knowing what it means essentially to be the slaves of another people. Egypt, a great empire at the time, which dominated and would brutalize any other culture that dared to differ, with a pharaonic dynasty, and of course the great pyramids that come out of this, and the notion that Pharaoh was the embodiment of God in time, and so to question him was to question Ra or Knata. I mean, there's various words for God in the Jewish or the Egyptian tradition. And so the Jews' primary experience post their affluent, because the original calling of the patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, and there's this promise of affluence and success, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there's this sort of this upwardly mobile success, material growth, or agricultural, but the sheep and prosperity and the children, and it's an image of, if you heed and you hear God, you will be prosperous. If you don't, there are negative consequences for doing so. But the Jews under Joseph that were, after Joseph died, became essentially the slaves in Egypt. Their story is one of being oppressed. Interestingly, many verses from the Hebrew canon, or hymns that come out of the Hebrew canon, were used by the blacks in the South. Chants and songs and hymns, because they understood the Egyptian, understood that Egyptian oppression the Jews were for. So the blacks often, particularly early pre-civil rights movement, very much identified with the Egypt was a key metaphor in that sense, that was used for both oppression and then liberation. And so the Jews' key experience in their political thinking, Exodus, freedom, but then as they leave Egypt, guided by Moses, and they're brought into this new land, they're given a text. Moses, whether it's Moses or others, we can conjecture on who wrote it, how it was brought to, but the belief that somehow God gave them this promised land, but there were a people in it. And so Deuteronomy is one of the first substantive political manifestos that was written, and it became the Blue Can or the Magna Carta for the Jews as they were entering in. It's a complex work. We won't read it in this course because you have to have a little bit of the background, the history, the names, and if people don't have any of those things, they could get lost in a snowstorm of people and names and places. But the theme, which is important to get here, is that Deuteronomy is not only, as I mentioned, the first political manifesto, but it's a complex, it's a polyphonic manifesto that on the one hand articulates a constitution in some sense for how the Jews are to live as a community and a nation in this new land that they're going into, and in which how they're to treat the widow, the foreigner, how they're to have Sabbaths, times of rest, how they're to treat animals. There's a significant element of Deuteronomy which is quite advanced for the time in terms of the treatment of the other animals, a work ethic in which puts a brake on workaholism in many ways. That's what Sabbath is about. Slow down, be still, be careful of being addicted to too much busyness. It will wreak havoc with the soul. So there's some amazing injunctions in Deuteronomy that are as relevant for today as it were for us. But there's also these injunctions, commands to go in and because there were people there, to wipe them out, to kill the men, the women, the children, the animals, because God told us to go in to do that. And so Deuteronomy it's a layered political manifesto, pre-Plato, pre-Aristotle, that offers an overview of how the Jews are to live, both within sort of domestic policy, if we can look at it that way, and then foreign policy. How are you to see the others, those who threaten you as an ethnic people? It is a theocratic tradition, which we hear democratic, which is the rule of the people. Theocratic just means the rule of God. God commands. You do what you're told. Don't ask questions. If you ask questions, there are serious consequences of that. But what gets raised in the Jewish tradition, even their sacred texts, is not so much the question of questioning God, but whose interpretation of God. And this is what, again, makes the text relevant for us today. You can have a lot of people today claiming to speak for God, but whose interpretation, whose version? Of course, you can go one direction and say, we're not even going to discuss that. We'll just be pure secular. So the ideology of secularism, which just ignores, it subordinates. Well, a person's free to do that, but they just put a leaden ceiling over their head, and they're just going to ignore it. It's like putting your head in the sand. A person's welcome to do that, but then they become irrelevant in trying to understand the bigger issues that are going on in the world today. So whether a person's religious or not, to ignore the religious, the sacred, is to ostrich-like have your head in the sand and then become quite inept or incompetent in interpreting and making sense of things. So when we get today different people coming from sacred or religious traditions claiming to say God said or God, and then they collide or they contradict, that's the same thing that's going on in Deuteronomy, is you have different people claiming, and so the text itself is a layered text of different voices, or what we call polyphony. Different voices at work that collide, that contradict. They're differently interpreting what they think God is saying to them as a people. And so then the big question becomes, in a theocratic tradition, whose version of God? And much of the Hebrew canon, which makes the Bible a fascinating text and perennially relevant, is you get this constant collision in the Jewish tradition of prophets, which are really the bulk of the Hebrew canon, claiming to speak for God about justice and peacemaking. And then you get the ethnic nationalists also claiming that God is for them, and they are to wipe out foreigners to the land, or to destroy people who are impeding their progress and taking over the land they believe God has given them. And so it's in this collision or hermeneutic of who speaks for God between prophets and kings and priests that you get the perennial significance of the Hebrew text, because you see exactly the same thing happening in the world today. People within Judaism or Christianity or Islam. If you secularize that, then you just say different interpretations of your new Deuteronomy, say a constitution or something, or a Bill of Rights. Well, whose interpretation of it? Well, that's where you get left and right divide. So it's your source of authority may be different. The fact that people collide on their interpretations of that authority is no different in the past than it is in the present in terms of dealing with issues. So the Jewish tradition is really, in the West, not only foundational in terms of its text, but its ongoing relevance for contemporary issues in the Middle East and elsewhere is important to understand. And the text, which obviously one and all should know if they're even going to be minimally educated, is the Bible. Now, people who don't have a background in the Bible they may be literate and they can speak and write English, but they're illiterate culturally. Just as if you go to India, you should know the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, or the Chitapatikaram, or other parts of the world, you should know Buddhism very well, or the Tao Te Ching, or places like that. People who don't have those basic working tools, they don't know how to make sense of what's happening in the world, and then they just retreat into their own private little world of skills and money making and amusements and diversions. And but anyone who's concerned with being a citizen and an educated citizen in this world should certainly have a background in these great works of literature, and not just as interesting artifacts of the past, but as their contemporary relevance for the present. Might also add, even though it's class in politics, some of the most brilliantly sensual literature and wisdom literature can be found in the Bible, whether it's Song of Songs, and anyone who reads that cannot help but be taken by the rich imagery and metaphor of relationships. In the book of Proverbs, the wisdom sayings of you choose this path, this is going to happen, choose this path, that. Some of the most honest and raw confessional literature you'll ever read is you'll get in the Psalms. People's sense of being deserted by God, and my God, why have you, deserted me? Where are you? Or Psalm 23, of course, which is a classic. The Lord is my shepherd. And so people in their journey through life feeling disoriented, and and Heidegger will pick up this in terms of a shepherd of being in these sorts of things. So some of the sort of texts that have come down to us through history, particularly biblical, they still place in anyone who's, for example, getting married in a Christian or Jewish tradition, they'll be constantly drawing from biblical texts. So not to know them, as I say, is to be just purely illiterate culturally and civilizationally, and there's no virtue in being ignorant in that sense in terms of what's going on. But again, often our public education is left as bereft in terms of not offering us a good education in humanities by which then we can make sense of the world that we're living in a substantive way. But the Jewish tradition post-biblical, also, for example, in the first century, if we had time to look at him, the major Jewish community in the first century was in Alexandria, which would be like a large Jewish community in New York today, or in Canada. Montreal was in Alexandria bigger than the Jewish community in Palestine. And you get someone like the Jewish philosopher Philo, with layered ways of reading the Hebrew canon, both literal, historic, grammatical. You get an allegorical, you get typological, you get anagogical. So Philo, people like Philo and many other Jewish philosophers were central in terms of looking at one thing. The text is important, but whose interpretation of the text? And this issue of hermeneutics just comes from Hermes, the Greek god who brings the message of Zeus to time, is very important. And people often have a very simplistic approach to interpreting a text that very much distorts the layered meaning of a text. So someone like Philo, the great Jewish philosopher, exegete, or interpreter, very important if one is to understand how the great rabbinical tradition of Judaism, in a very layered, complex, and contradictory or conflicting way, attempted to interpret their own heritage and tradition. So someone like, by the first century, Philo is very important. He played a role in the whole Alexandrian traditions. One thing to say, a text is important, but equally important, how is that text to be interpreted? And what are the layers of interpretation that the Jews have articulated? And of course, Philo himself comes from a much older classical Greek tradition. What's Plato and Aristotle doing with Homer? What are they doing with Hesiod? What are they doing with Virgil's Aeneid? So do we just read it literally? Or is there layers of reading Homer? Is there layers of reading Hesiod and within the Roman tradition, Virgil's Aeneid, for example? And so we read these great works of literature. In this case, the Jewish tradition, Philo is very important in that. It's one thing to say a text is important, but how is a text to be read? How is it to be interpreted? How is it be applied in a person's journey? You can get the dilemma we face today. You have certain sort of secularists that say, why would we even be concerned with something like that? Religion's about violence, it's about oppression, and there's a list of negative things they trot out, or sort of the laundry list of an ideological read. So secularism just ignores it, or they take the worst side of variations of fundamentalism, have very literalist, simplistic reads of a text, or one one-dimensional reeds in which there's not layered reeds. Now, the Jewish tradition of philo and what's back of philo in the great Greek tradition and what Christians will pick up in Alexandria, the Alexandrian tradition of Plotinus and Clement and Origen, you have layered reeds. So what the Jewish tradition when it comes to religion, text, interpretation is very valuable to know also. I'll just scamper forward a little bit here because time is running out on this micro lecture, but really, for 2,000 years, you have the Jews scattered, the diaspora, in many ways marginalized in ghettos, mistreated. You have some tried to assimilate into an emerging liberal ethos in Germany and other places. But definitely anti-Semitism is a part of that story, as well as, I might add, philo-Semitism. There's a strong Anglo-German philo-Semitic tradition as well that was a part of creating, in one ways, Jewish Zionism of the late 19th century under Theodor Herzl. But this marginalization, this mistreatment, this ghettoization of the Jews, similar to the way they were treated in Egypt, then leads to, obviously, the longing to find a place where they'll be protected by their own people in which they won't be marginalized. This tradition, which begins to emerge Jewish and Christian Zionists, right-wing Christians that link up with, in one sense, right-of-center Jews. The early origins of Jewish Zionism were very secular, but they became very religious as they moved on. And the secular Jews and religious Jews both agreed that somehow they needed a homeland. That homeland was promised to them within their historic sources, the Bible. And so eventually through Balfour Declaration, the return gradually of the Jews throughout the 20th century, Holocaust was really just an amplified Egyptian experience in some ways. And then the longing for a homeland, 1948, and the never again story. And then the complex nature of the Jewish community today, as it was in the biblical phase of who speaks for God. And this becomes within the Jewish community. You have very secular Jews who just can't believe in God anymore. To them, that's just bizarre. Where was God in the camps? How can you possibly believe in some ultimate being who's eminent, is involved with the people, cares for them? Because you have in the biblical stories, you have sort of victory stories. Moses takes the people out of slavery. Daniel is not killed by the lions in the lion's den. After Job's suffering, he's given everything he wants back. Samson overcomes the enemy. They're stories that God is eminent and with them, and as a result of that, good, happy ending. Well, for many of the Jews in the 30s and the 40s in the camps, and of course the millions who died, there's this sense, how can you claim to speak of God eminent and with us and the shepherd in that sense of the people? That's a bizarre idea. We were orphaned, we were left alone, nobody was there to rescue us whatsoever. So a lot of secular Jews today, they'll work closely with religious Jews, and what they both share is the Zionist ideology. Their justifications for the ideology are quite different. Their conclusions are much the same, particularly right-wing Zionism, secular or Jewish in that sense. There's also a dovish wing of Judaism as well that can be religious and secular as well. The belief that as Jews, they're meant to be lights in the world. They were called by God to be agents of justice, to be prophetic agents. And so in Israel today, you get the dovish Orthodox, who are very opposed to the militarization of Israel, to the linking up of Israel with the United States. And interestingly, as some of you are probably aware recently, certainly the last while with Trump, was quite willing to move the American embassy to Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv, and even recently with the annexation, one of the sections in the West Bank is, what did they call it? We call it Trump Heights. So you can see this link up in which the state of Israel, Netanyahu, Trump, even our own Canadian government under Trudeau is very pro-Israel. And so the reasons for it are different. The conclusions are much the same. You don't critique Israel. And of course, then the victims of that are the Palestinians, the Muslims, the Christians in West Bank and Gaza, of course, is a terrible prison. To be there is to see some of the worst living conditions in the world today. And then East Jerusalem, and then refugee camps that many Palestinians are in. So the issue of the Jewish tradition, its polyphonic nature between a nationalism, which it's my people, right or wrong, state of Israel, you can find that in the biblical phase, and you can find the marginalizations of the Jews in history, and then the Holocaust leads to never again. So therefore we have to have land, and of course they remember the age of Saul and David and Solomon, and the high point of Jewish political power, in the sense, well, that's what it means to be a Jew. We have to have military. We have to align with powerful nations to prevent ever being marginalized, ghettoized, Holocaust ever again. And so the polyphonic nature of Judaism, they're not no community is homogeneous, but to understand the Western tradition, essential to understand how the Bible continues to have a significant role in what is going on in Israel, the Palestinians, elements of Christianity today, and the impact of that on many other people, and how major powers like the United States and Canada and others tend to be uncritical of the state of Israel, either for religious reasons or Holocaust reasons, and the implications for basic things like human rights on the Palestinians.